Boa tarde. Dando continuidade à nossa ELT Week de 2024, vamos dar boas-vindas a Mina Patel. A Mina Patel é pesquisadora do Grupo de Pesquisa em Avaliação do British Council. A formação dela é em ensino de língua inglesa. Ela já trabalhou no Reino Unido, Grécia, Tailândia, Sri Lanka e Malásia como professora e também formadora de professores, desenvolvedora de materiais e gestora de projetos de ELT. Ela tem uma vasta experiência de trabalho com ministérios da educação no leste asiático. A Mina também já fez apresentações em inúmeras conferências nacionais e internacionais sobre assuntos relacionados ao ELT, inclusive algumas no Brasil. E ela é a autora principal da pesquisa Futuro do Inglês, Perspectivas Globais do British Council. O link, se alguém quiser saber mais, já está no nosso chat. E atualmente ela também é estudante de doutorado no Centro de Pesquisa em Aprendizado e Avaliação de Língua Inglesa da Universidade de Bedfordshire, no Reino Unido. E hoje ela vai nos falar sobre avaliação em ELT e futuro do inglês.
Hello everybody, my name is Mina Patel and I am Head of Research for the British Council's Future of English programme. I am delighted to be talking to you today during ELT Week about the future of English language assessment. So, in today's presentation, I will give you a little bit of an overview about the future of English. And then I'll talk about assessment and personalising assessment a little bit, and then think about things to consider as we move forward into the future. what is the Future of English programme? The Future of English programme is a research agenda. It's a long-term research agenda. And what we hope to do through it is really to provide insights on trends that will define the role of English as a global language over the next decade. So what is impacting on English? How is it being defined? What is driving it? And we want to use those findings really to inform English language education, policy and practice. But as I say, the main aim of the programme is really that long-term agenda, because one of the things is about the English language, we know that it is the global lingua franca, we know that there are lots of speakers, but we don't know how many speakers there are, we don't know how they're using the language. We have lots of research around English, but we don't really have very much robust methodology or the instruments to track this, and this is what we hope to generate from the Future of English programme. The programme is built in 3 phases. In the second phase, we did some research. We talked to policymakers and influencers all around the world about what they thought about the English language and where it was going and how it's being used in their context. And the output from phase 2 was a Future of English Global Perspectives. Now that describes the programme as a whole, but it also shares the findings from this research. And if you scan that QR code, you can download a free copy of it. So before I do share the findings with you, just to say, so in 2021, we talked to 92 policymakers and influencers from 49 countries and territories. And we asked them, what do you think is the future of English? How is it being used? How do you think it will change? And from talking to these 92 very nice participants, we found the following findings. So there are 8 thematic areas. And at the beginning, when we were doing this, we thought that we were actually going to make predictions about the English language and where it was going, but we were quite naive actually, because with the amazing data that we had, these 8 thematic areas came out quite clearly across the world. But it was obvious that within each of these 8 thematic areas, there were still lots and lots and lots of questions to be answered. And that's why we've posed them as questions. So number 1, will English remain the world's most sought after language? Number 2, what role will English play in our multilingual reality? Number 3, what is the future of English as a medium of education? Number 4, how will teachers remain relevant in future English language learning systems? Number 5, public and private English language provision. Who has the answers? Number 6, the one that we're going to talk about today, can English language assessment meet stakeholders' changing needs? Number 7, can technology narrow the equity gap in English language education? And number 8, to what extent is employment driving the future of English? Now, I don't have time today to go into all of these, but I think you'll just see from the topics that they're focused on that actually they are relevant globally. However, in different contexts, different themes will be relevant in different ways. Not all of the themes are as important in every context, but I think that's pretty obvious. So we have these 8 thematic questions, but we also have 3 common threads that run through all of them. So, for example, education policy. Education policy is of critical importance. It really doesn't matter the resources that you have, where you teach, how many students you have in a class, or really what you believe about teaching and learning, because 90% of what happens in a classroom is based on policy. And we are assessed on what happens in the classroom. Our students are assessed on what happens in the classroom, and therefore we do try and stick to policy as much as we can. The other common thread that runs through all of it is stakeholders, and something that came out in our data is the importance of the variety of stakeholders that now have a vested interest in English language teaching and education. For example, parents are becoming more and more prominent. During COVID, they actually had their children learning at home, they found out more about their children's learning, they're more about their children's education, and they are naturally more interested now. Learners, obviously, learners are incredibly important stakeholders. We all know that. But learners have changed also during the pandemic. They are now more aware of the opportunities that are available to them. They are now learning increasingly online, interacting online, and technology has a huge part to play in that. But the other stakeholder that came out really, really importantly was the employer. So employers are saying, basically, you know what, the young people that you're getting through school and sending to us for initial employment, they don't seem to be ready for the working environment. And you know, 20 years ago, you guys in education, you said that you were going to work on the 21st century skills. What happened to these core skills? Why aren't young people coming through education being ready for the jobs that they are being employed for? Big questions, I know, but employers are a big, big stakeholder. Equality, diversity and inclusion. I can't have a conversation about English language teaching and education without EDI being mentioned. And I know in many circles now people put justice at the beginning of that, so it's justice, equality, diversity, inclusion. But when we were collecting our data, the concept that came out was equality, diversity, inclusion. Now, the participants that we spoke to, they all understand the importance of EDI. They all understand the importance of education being fair and just and equal opportunities for all. What they find difficult, what the questions are around, is how do you operationalize it? How do you actually make it a reality? Because sometimes it can be resource intensive. It certainly needs teacher training. So good in theory and recognised as being very, very important, but questions around operationalizing it. So if you want to read more about these themes, I gave you the QR code for the book, but there's also a research summary on that same website. So there's a shortened version where you can find out a bit more about these themes. But as I said, today we're going to be talking about assessment. So when we talk about assessment, we generally talk about assessment as being developmental, and some people call that formative. So assessing for learning. So your assessment is helping young people in the learning process. But then there are also judgmental assessments. So some people call that summative assessment. So where you have an end of term, end of year, end of course test, and you get a score. But I think kind of there's a grey area in between really, because I think that even when you're doing formative assessment for learning, you are assessing and you are judging. There is a judgment there. There has to be a judgment. There has to be some kind of evaluation. And I also think that summative assessment can feed back into learning as well. So I do think there's a kind of grey area there that needs to be explored. I'm not going to explore it today, but I think I'm just going to leave it there for you to think about. We always kind of divide the two, kind of formatives here and summatives here, but actually I think there is a little bit of an overlap. And I'll talk about that as I illustrate a bit further. So for the next few slides, I'm going to ask you just to bear with me because I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey, use myself as an example, and talk to you about how I believe that on the whole, we're always being assessed and we are always assessing. So bear with me and come with me on this little journey. So assessment through Mina's ages. My parents are from India. They met and got married in Uganda. After Uganda, me and my brothers and sisters were born there. We then went over to England. And I was educated in England, spent all of my childhood and did my degree there. And then once I got my master's degree, I went over to Malaysia. and I spent 20 years there, and now I have a foot both in Malaysia and in England. So that's a little bit of context about me. So as a child, that's me with my passport photo at the age of 4, going over from Uganda to England. The various things that I was assessed on. So I was assessed on my English. I didn't speak English when I first went to England. I was assessed on my Gujarati because my parents wanted me to learn Gujarati, which is my mother tongue. And as I kind of got into school, you go through primary and secondary, end of year tests, end of term tests, your homework. I remember in primary school, we had spelling tests every Monday. And of course, at home, even though I was little, I was assessed on my chores. So, you know, I was being assessed at home and at school. And then as a young adult, that's me, you have your kind of school assessments. So you had O levels, you had A levels, degree, of course. Then again, on a personal level, your driving test. You get tested on how well you can drive and whether you're safe to be on the road. With my friends, you're assessed on your fashion sense. At home, I was assessed on my traditional cultural compass. So don't forget, I was a young Indian girl living in England and trying to make her way there with very traditional parents. And as a young Indian girl, one of the things that I was assessed on was whether I could cook. And we'll come back to that in just a moment. Now, as an adult, with one foot in Malaysia and one foot in the UK, you know, on a daily basis, and I think that people can resonate with this. I'm assessed as a mother. What kind of mother am I? I'm assessed as what kind of a wife am I? Now, fortunately, I'm assessed on what kind of a grandmother I am. That's at home, right? So at work, what kind of an employee am I? I get evaluations every year. What kind of a colleague am I? What kind of a researcher am I? What kind of a presenter am I? And I'm doing a PhD at the moment, hopefully nearly completing. What kind of a student am I? So this isn't a definitive list. These are just examples from my life on how I think that I'm assessed kind of all the time, right? Okay, just hold that thought for a minute. So I'm going to tell you about something really exciting happened to me just a couple of months ago. Oh, before I do that, so personal, educational, professional. So you're assessed everywhere, all the time, right? So down to my exciting thing that happened to me. So I think you recognise this young lady, and if you don't, her name is Taylor Swift, and I was fortunate enough to go to one of her concerts because my niece had a ticket, right? Now, I know a couple of Taylor Swift songs. Am I a fan? I'm not sure I am. But there I went. There I went with my niece to watch Taylor Swift at Anfield in June. Okay, so we got to the stadium, and I think I'm the only person in the audience who doesn't have a Taylor Swift t-shirt on or an outfit like Taylor Swift, but that's absolutely fine. So this stadium has got 68,000 people in it. That's a lot of people, a lot of people. So Taylor Swift is really famous. People really like it. 68,000 people, that's a lot of people. So in 3 hours, she plays 39 songs, which is pretty amazing, right? I think that's amazing in terms of kind of showmanship. 67,999 people know the words to every song in those 3 hours. Guess who's the only person that didn't? Me. So next to me, there's a lady, right? And she's going crazy for every song, giving all of this, and all of that. Everybody is. And I can see her looking at me, right? And she's looking at me. And I'm thinking, why is she looking at me? And she's staring at me. And I'm thinking, why is she staring at me? And in the end, she taps me on the shoulder. And I say, yes. And she looks at me up and down. And I say, yes. And she goes, what are you doing here? And I was like shocked. And I said, why did you ask that? And she looked me up and down again. And the reason she was asking is because I had my hands folded, standing there. And what was I doing? I was assessing Taylor Swift. I was assessing her, not because it was my job to assess her, because I that's what people do. And she was brilliant, don't get me wrong, she was brilliant, but I didn't know the words of the song. I didn't know what all the hype was about. I wanted to find out, and there I was. So why am I telling you all of this? I'm telling you this because we are all assessors in life. That's what we do. Although we don't know we're doing it, may not be conscious. Um, and learners, therefore, they don't come to class as blank sheets. They've been assessed all their lives. Now, whether that assessment has been very transparent and they know what they're being assessed on, or whether it's just part of life, they don't come to class as blank sheets. So therefore, how can we help them? What is it that we can do? Um, what we can do is really support them with a type of assessment that we give them at different stages. And what we can do is make explicit what very often in classrooms is very implicit. We assume students know, or we think that they should know, regardless of their age, but they don't always know. I mean, if you look at my list, I didn't have names for assessment. I didn't know what assessment was. I didn't know what being judged was. I didn't know what having to pass was all the time. But I knew that it existed. I knew that I had to jump through hoops. I had to do what teachers told me. And very often, I didn't know why though. So, what can we do in class to help students? Helping learners with assessment. They need to know why they're being assessed. I know this sounds really obvious, but the number of times that students don't know, they need to know why they're being assessed. They need to know how they're being assessed, and this is more tangible and it's easier. What's the format? What does it look like? Are there 10 questions? Are there 5 questions? What kind of questions are they? What is the content? What am I being assessed on? Is it from the words from last week? Or is it from the whole story from last week? Or is it on my grammar? Or is it on my spec? What is it? And please don't say the content is everything all the time, because it can't be and it shouldn't be, right? Especially when we're talking about young learners. You need to build their assessment up. It's like stepping stones, right? You need to build it up a little at a time. So you can't assess learners on everything all the time. And the fourth box is really important. How are you going to use my results? Are you going to feed the results back into my learning? Are you going to give me feedback? Are you going to tell me what I did well? Are you going to tell me what I didn't do so well? And therefore I can feed that into my own learning and progression. Or are you going to use a score? Are you going to use a score to judge me and then put me in an appropriate level of class moving forward? Or is a score going to be used to judge whether I go to university? So these 3 things are really, I think, quite basic and fundamental, but very often they're forgotten because we're busy trying to get through the curriculum. We need to get this done, we need to get that done, but this is really, really important. And then they need parameters. So when you're growing up, you don't always have those parameters, but those parameters, what are the expectations? Yeah, what is being tested? How is it being tested? And there needs to be transparency. And one of these things teachers often say to me, well, it's not easy because you've got to get through so much. How do you help them with this? Well, to me, I'll be very frank with you. I think it's simple learner training. This has to start when students are young. And it can start in interesting ways. It can start as part of lessons, but they need to know that assessment is going to be something that happens throughout their education, and it will. I think it's a teacher's job to be able to support students. So these are very simple things that teachers can do. Now, one thing that I hear a lot about is self-assessment and peer assessment, and that's absolutely fine. But I'd like to say here and now, self-assessment is not easy. So I took my little activities that I showed you earlier and I assessed myself using the very basic green, amber, and red. So red is, I don't think I'm doing very well. Green is, I think I'm okay, right? And amber is, well, I'm okay, but I could do better. So just before this presentation, I kind of did my own self-assessment, and it really wasn't easy. So for example, I'm presenting to you now. What kind of presenter am I? I'm too scared to assess myself because I might say, oh, I think I'm okay, but you might think I'm absolutely awful, right? So if I feel like that as an experienced adult talking to you guys, how do you think it is for young people to be doing this, not in their own language, but in a second language or a foreign language? So I'm not saying don't do self-assessment, and I'm not saying that it's not important and not valuable. I'm saying help your students with it. So start small, think about those stepping stones. And if they don't respond, it's probably not because they don't know what they're doing or they don't know how to. It's scary business. So just think about that, food for thought. So how does this all fit into the comprehensive learning system? Now, I don't know if you've heard about the comprehensive learning system. This is something that Barry O'Sullivan wrote about in 2020. It isn't a new concept, but what I do like about Barry's version is that it's very accessible. He writes it in very accessible language that makes it easy to understand. And his basic premise is that um, a comprehensive learning system is where all of the elements of the learning system, curriculum, delivery, and assessment, are aligned. They work together in harmony. They are underpinned by one single philosophy of learning, and they are built on around standards as well. And the idea is that if one corner of the triangle is a little bit weaker, the system will not work as well as it could do. Okay, and so a comprehensive learning system sits within a context of use that is made up of the stakeholders within that context. And those stakeholders, be they curriculum developers, assessment experts, teachers, educators, policymakers, parents, whoever they are, they make up the socio-cultural values in that context. And they really shape what the context looked like. So when we think about assessment, an assessment, as you can see, doesn't sit on its own, it's part of a system. Very often we think about assessment as being alone, a standalone thing. Oh, let's teach this unit, oh, and then think about assessment. Or let's create this course, oh, but then how are we going to assess it? Well, what the comprehensive learning system tells us is that right from the beginning, right from its inception, we need to think about assessment. We need to build it in and not think about it on its own. So assessment is not an island, it's part of a system that should be integrated. So within any comprehensive learning system, there are standards. So we're working towards something. Those standards might be international standards, they might be national standards, they might be regional standards, but there are always standards. There are expectations, right? So as a school, decision makers will have expectations, policy makers will have expectations. You as educators have expectations, parents have expectations. And through our assessment, through our comprehensive learning system, we need to kind of somehow marry all of those expectations. And the other thing about assessment is that it does sit in socio-cultural context. So what assessment might mean in one context, what it might mean for me in Malaysia, may not be the same as what it means for you, wherever you are. So it's a very cultural thing. And assessment is shaped around that. So there are lots of things going on when we think about assessment, even before we think about the classroom. So let's think about assessment moving forwards. And the next few slides I'm going to share with you are actually from the data that we collected to write Future of English Global Perspectives. So Challenges and changes, or changes and challenges. So in terms of changes that are impacting on assessment, the concept of proficiency is changing. As more and more contexts become multilingual, languages merge. People use different languages with each other. Translanguaging is becoming more popular. And in these contexts, people really aren't looking to sound like native speakers. What they're doing is they're wanting to be understood and to understand in order to get um, something done. They want to achieve a goal, and therefore they use the language that they have at hand. So it's not about sounding like a native speaker anymore. Um, and coupled with that, English is no longer seen as an isolated item. English is not so much taught as a subject anymore. It's used to teach other subjects. So English is being integrated into kind of mainstream curricula more and more. And this poses challenges for assessment. So we're now looking for assessment that is creative, contextual, relevant, and holistic. And that's not easy. These are big things. We're not saying that every assessment has to be that. But what we're looking for is assessment that can really help to measure where not only where students are, but where they need to go and how they need to get there as well. The other challenge is language assessment literacy, and this is a huge one. There's been a lot of work done around language assessment literacy for teachers. However, more work needs to be done, especially as in most pre-service education courses, assessment is still that little add-on. There isn't much time really invested in it. But I'm not just talking about language assessment literacy for teachers. Language assessment literacy is for everyone. It's for students, it's for parents, it is for policymakers. They need to know about assessment if they're going to make decisions about it. So, and this is a big, big, big challenge. People who use assessment, work with assessment, need to know about assessment and how it works. Okay, so assessment for learning. Assessment for learning. So we all know the benefits of assessment for learning. It enables teachers to provide continuous feedback for learners. You know, what are their strengths? What are the areas that they need improving on? It helps learners with goal setting, but it also informs our own teaching. So where do learners need more support? Where do we feel that they're getting enough support? But what are the challenges around assessment for learning? So one of the challenges is that people who decide, decision makers, who decide that assessment for learning is important, don't really understand what it is, and therefore don't really recognise the time it takes for assessment for learning to work properly and how it can shape classroom practice. And another challenge is the lack of preparation for teachers. Many teachers aren't actually trained in how to use assessment for learning in a meaningful and relevant way for their learners. And then we have assessment of learning. So in our data, where assessment of learning came across was around assessment for employment. So we all recognise that standardised testing is important, but are they meeting employers' needs? And employers are saying, well, actually, no, they're not really meeting our needs because, you know, an employee can get a certain score in a test, but that doesn't mean that they can do the job or perform the functions they're supposed to. And what employers are looking for is assessment that is more skills-based, more flexible, and more personalised. Localisation. This is very important. So localisation, large-scale standardised tests. So we've already talked about this. our participants recognise the importance of them and their place in the whole ecosystem of teaching and learning. However, what they were asking about was local versions and varieties of English and whether there may be a place for those in that ecosystem as well. The CFR, so increasingly education systems wanted to integrate teaching, learning and assessment, and using the CFR as a framework to do that. So for example, in Japan, they have localized the CFR. So they've got CFR-J. The other thing, and this was from the round tables in Asia, so questioning native speaker norms and the desire for accuracy, and saying that perhaps curricula are going to be more context and competency based moving forward. So technology, my favourite subject. So technology and assessment, what are the benefits? So one of the things that technology can help test takers with is anytime learning and assessment. So on the move, on your devices, wherever you are, it can be more personalised, be localised, and you can get feedback. And all of that is possible if you have the infrastructures, if you have the technology, right? But there are challenges. There's no control of the learning trajectory. If you want assessment and learning to be personalised and independent and autonomous, then there isn't as much control as we have in the current infrastructures that we have, right? And there is a danger that with these kind of free-flowing, personalised, on-the-move assessments, that technology will drive assessment. And it becomes less about the subject or the language you want to be assessed and more about the technology that is available. I've just put a QR code there for you for a report that the British Council co-authored last year, and it's about teachers' perceptions of AI in their classroom context. It's worth having a look, it's very accessible. Language assessment literacy. So I said earlier that this is really important, and it is really important. Assessment carries currency. It has consequences. It doesn't matter whether it's formative assessment in the classroom or summative assessment. If a student is being assessed, there are consequences. And for that student, more often than not, it's always high stakes, right? So we talk about high stakes, low stakes. I'm not really sure about that. I think that for a test taker, it always seems to be about high stakes. Decision makers, test providers, test users, they have responsibility to know about assessment, to know that they're making the right decisions, to know how scores are being used. The responsibility isn't only on the teacher, it's on everybody. And I think that we need to help parents understand assessment more. We need to certainly help our students understand assessment more. So where in the past, language assessment literacy, a lot of the time was around teachers and teacher educators, I believe it's for everyone, absolutely everyone. So what is the need for, what is needed for assessment moving forward? I think that policymakers, they need a basic understanding of how teaching, learning and assessment work and how they work together. And I think policymakers need to work more closely with employers in order to see what they need and how we can marry our systems to employers' needs. I think teachers need solid foundational pedagogy about assessment and assessment practices. And I think that pre-service education needs to have a look at exactly the role that assessment plays in getting our teachers, preparing our teachers for the classrooms of not only today, but of tomorrow. And I think the thing that researchers and test providers need to think about is assessment driving technology, or is it the other way around? And I certainly hope it's not the other way around. On that note, thank you very much. I hope you have a great week. Thank you for listening to my talk. Take care. Bye bye.
A apresentação foi ótima, como sempre. Pessoal, por motivos de fuso horário, a Mina não pôde estar conosco para as perguntas, mas se alguém quiser saber mais sobre a pesquisa de Future of English que ela mencionou, o link já está no chat, assim como o link para as inscrições, caso alguém ainda não tenha se inscrito. Muito obrigada a todos vocês, obrigada pelas interações. A gente está lendo aqui todos os comentários. E agora a gente vai fazer mais um pequeno intervalo até às 6 horas da tarde, quando a gente vai voltar com o Guilherme Meira falando o último assunto, a última sessão do dia sobre assessment. Obrigada.